Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Skyline View podcast. This is Zachary Navarra back with another episode of TSV Politics. We're covering the June 7th primary race in California for the 15th congressional districts, where we talk to the different candidates running to replace Congresswoman Jackie Spears. Today, we are talking to Councilmember Emily Beach. Thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure, Zachary. Thanks for inviting me.
So let's get right into it. Why don't you tell us why you're running and what drove you to announce?
Thanks. No, Congresswoman Spear has been such an amazing representative for our district for so many years. One of the reasons I threw my hat in the ring is I think I've got the right broad life experience and skills at this time to lead the district and to help actually lead in Washington. I think I bring some very different kind of experience to this race than some of the other candidates. We've got big challenges in this country. We've got to save our planet from climate change. We have to improve the great inequalities in our country in terms of wealth, in terms of systemic racism, and we've got to restore trust in our government officials and our institutions. And I think because I've worked in so many different walks of life, I've served as a United States Army officer, I've worked in the private sector as a business executive in the business world. I've run a nonprofit organization, and for 7 years, I've been in local government as a city council member and a trusted mayor in Burlingame. I'm a parent of teenagers. I think I bring some broad life experience. I think I've shown throughout my life I have the ability to be bold and courageous, challenge the status quo, which is certainly what I'm doing right now. And I've got the right leadership skills. And I know what this district needs, having worked at the grassroots level where the rubber meets the road in local government. I know the kinds of policies that can help cities and communities thrive. And so I think I bring a really unique skill set to the mix.
Yeah, I want to dive into that skill set and your experiences. So can you talk more about why it's important that our district represents a veteran?
Well, thank you for asking that particular question. I think more than any other elected position, members of Congress, I think, can really benefit from having some kind of military experience. Right now, our Congress is at an all-time low since World War II of the number of members of Congress that actually have worn the uniform and have any of that experience. We're at 17%. Back when I was growing up, so I'm 47 years old now. So back in the 70s, we had about 73% of Congress had military experience. And that matters a lot because Congress makes decisions about foreign policy, sets military budgets, decides whether or not we send our daughters and sons into harm's way, into military conflict. I believe we also really need veterans leading the way, veterans who understand the dangerous tools of warfare to lead the charge on making sure we've got common sense gun control in this country, because it's ridiculous and insane what we have, the number of automatic weapons out there. And we just had another tragedy the weekend before last in Sacramento. So I think there's a lot of really relevant reasons in terms of policy, but also in terms of leadership skills that veterans bring. Certainly veteran services are important too. Folks who have worn the uniform and served the country need to be taken care of after they serve. There's huge issues in terms of healthcare, but also mental health. But I would say that the other thing that veterans bring that really is a superpower in a way is that we are trained to put country and service above self. And that's a really important skill right now with the dysfunction and the gridlock in Washington. People who are bold and who are trained to put aside some differences and work with people on teams from all walks of life, every different corner of this country. That's what I had to do in the Army. I trained and lived in Texas. I trained in Georgia, Kentucky, North Carolina. I've worked with people from all these different parts of the country, lived around the world, lived in Korea, lived in Saudi Arabia, led a Patriot missile battery there. When you are forced to be a team member with people from all different walks of life, you put aside petty differences, and you have to learn to trust one another because your life depends on it. Those are really important skills, and I think we can have a higher call in DC to help move the country forward. I think those are important skills.
I want to highlight, you mentioned military budgets. So Jackie Spears has in the past voted to decrease our military budget by, I think, 10%. Where do you stand on that? Would you continue that legacy or would you chart your own path?
I think I would have to dig into the details, and that's something that we delegate to our legislators. And I have great trust in Congresswoman Spears' commitment and to dig into the details. So I would certainly lean in and give her votes the benefit of the doubt. How I would approach this, though, would be to say, look, we need a strong national defense. That's important, but we also need to be great world partners. And that having a strong national defense doesn't mean you necessarily need to spend the most money. And there's also an element of foreign policy where we have to be good partners in the world and make sure that we're helping countries, emerging countries, combat climate change, and that we're investing in clean water so we avoid displacement and disruption that can sometimes cause global conflict when people don't have the basic resources they need. We can be good partners. In our country's history, we haven't always been the greatest partners. In Latin America, sometimes we've caused some challenges to destabilize countries. So I think we need to be good international partners. We need to always lean into diplomacy first, and we absolutely need a strong national defense. But I think technology is another important part, and innovation is where we can hopefully save lives with the military as we move forward.
So with the importance of diplomacy, where do you think Congress should go in terms of reining back some of the presidential war powers that were expanded in the early 2000s? Do you think it should try to rein some of those back or maybe expand on them?
I think that's a great question. I think Congress is really the place that is required for the balance of power to have that oversight. I think we probably went a little too far with 9/11 and what Congress empowered from the president, and even bordering on civil liberties being at stake. So I think we do need to make sure Congress holds the power to declare war and continues to lean in and oversee. There's certainly the commander in chief needs appropriate power as well, but Congress holds the purse strings, and Congress needs to have oversight because Congress is the voice really of the people.
Speaking of the voice of the people, I know that Congress tends to underrepresent women, and you happen to be the only woman running for Congress. So
This is true.
can you speak to the importance of that? And also
Excuse-
speak to the importance of having a woman replace a current woman incumbent?
Well, appreciate that. I think organizations, whether they're in the private sector, whether they're in the public sector, the nonprofit sector, from my experience, organizations function better when there's greater diversity in its representation. We need diversity of gender, we need diversity of color, we need diversity of backgrounds. That strengthens organizations because it makes sure that we're looking from all perspectives and addressing all needs. Congress only has 27% women right now, and we're over 50% of the population. I think particularly at this moment in time where there's so many issues that Congresswoman Spear was championing for many years, right? The ERA, passing the ERA, pay equity, sexual harassment issues, right? She was a champion and is a champion for combating sexual harassment in the military. Definitely have observed that issue in the military myself. But right now, above all, I think reproductive freedom is perhaps the most important, if I had to prioritize, issue that's happening in the federal government. And there's actually, with the courts threatening and with states threatening reproductive freedoms throughout the country, the federal government needs to step in and be very decisive to make sure that people's freedoms are preserved. And there is a solution that we can take Roe v. Wade out of the courts. We can actually codify reproductive freedom into law. And that's going to require making sure we keep the full Democratic caucus together and maybe some more moderate Republicans. I think at this moment in time, more than ever, we need women on the front line of those battles advocating for reproductive freedom. We need women like me who are Catholic. I went to the University of Notre Dame. I understand the other side and the concerns, but I am strongly pro-choice, and I think I can help broker some of those agreements to actually get reproductive freedom codified into law that is so important for all women, but it's particularly important for women of color and poor women that will be victim of not having the health care and the services that they need if we don't get this thing fixed. And it's just being threatened all over the country. So I think, no other candidate in this race has had the federal government try to legislate over their bodies. And I do think that women need to be on the front lines talking about pay equity, talking about affordable childcare, advocating for paid parental leave. This affects our careers, our lives, our economic power, and certainly our reproductive freedom. And with only 27% women in Congress, I don't want to see us lose further firsthand, authentic representation on these issues.
How do you try to balance working with more moderate Democrats or even moderate Republicans with fighting for arguably pretty progressive goals like the child care and parental leave?
Well, I think we need to be able to relate to one another. I'm a huge believer in my 47 years and in working with people in all different kinds of organization and walks of life. I believe in relationship-centered change, in making connections and finding ways to find common ground with people that you may not necessarily think you do. And I think my broad experience, particularly, I can go to DC, be rock solid in what our Bay Area 15th congressional district values are, advocate for them, and never flinch. But I can also look across the aisle at maybe the congresswoman from Indiana who is staunchly pro-life and find some common ground, because guess what? I went to school there and I know that the Midwestern people are about the kindest, friendliest people that will, car breaks down on the side of the road, they'll take you home for dinner and put you up in their guest room. I understand the other side of that argument. On the folks on the right will probably have some degree of respect for the fact that I am an Army veteran and that I have earned my Army Airborne parachute patch and jumped out of airplanes and served forward deployed in Korea and in Saudi Arabia. I may be a Bay Area liberal in their mind, but I will be able to say, hey, I'm a veteran too. And where can we agree on infrastructure? Or can we agree that should women really be going back to work 10 days after they give birth? I think that's a health care issue. That's not really a matter for being a modern, industrialized country. We should do more for paid parental leave. Can we agree on those issues? And I think I have the unique ability, because I've worked in different walks of life, that I think I may be able to connect with some of those folks over the long haul to build those relationships, to get something done, maybe not on the fringes, but certainly work to negotiate how to move the country forward on critical issues that we need to resolve.
So you brought up infrastructure as one of the ways you can work with more moderate members of the party and of the opposing party.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about what your plans for infrastructure are and how you would use your local representative as a council member to kind of translate that to know what local needs are?
Thanks. I probably the area of policy where I've spent the most work at the local level, both as a city council member, but also as a regional transportation leader. So I chaired the San Mateo County Transportation Authority Board of Directors for 2 years, overseeing basically the Transportation Authority oversees about $3 billion of tax revenue over the next, until the expiration of the tax measure, which the voters have renewed twice and hopefully will do a third time, but really investing in sustainable transportation infrastructure. We do a great job locally. We use those local tax dollars, but we desperately need to leverage those funds to get federal funds to come and do the big projects. Like as our Caltrain service grows, we need to keep our community safe and not have gridlock in the communities. And we need to make sure that the railroad tracks are separated from the roadway. That's called a grade separation. We need huge federal funds. And we've got about $10 billion worth of need, B with a billion, on the Caltrain line. To put it in perspective, to electrify the whole Caltrain fleet from the diesel cars, the transition that's happening right now to electric cars, cost about $2 billion. So we need that order of magnitude for safety improvements at the local level that I've seen firsthand, we really need a strong United Bay Area delegation. Now, thank goodness for the infrastructure package that was just passed. And I applaud Congress and the president for signing that into law this past fall. We're going to have an injection of infrastructure dollars, which is going to make a huge difference for Caltrain, for our roads, for our sustainable bike lanes and pedestrian improvements, which I'm passionate about. I've worked a lot on those issues too. But Build Back Better, which wasn't passed in the Senate, has a lot of missed opportunities, a lot of additional funding for climate action, for rebates and helping people, invest in infrastructure in their homes to get solar panels, to, get their water heaters changed out, to do a myriad of different things that we could do sustainable infrastructure. It also is a huge missed opportunity for childcare infrastructure in terms of things I was talking about before, paid parental leave or different, universal pre-K. And those are missed opportunities. Those are investing in our country's infrastructure too. So I think we need to go back and continue to be persistent on a lot of those issues. And as great as that federal infrastructure package that was passed, we are going to continue to need more dollars, and we need, orders of magnitude throughout the whole country, not just certainly for the 15th congressional district, because we depend so much on sustainable transportation, but the whole country needs it, and that's a great investment in good green jobs too.
When fighting for more infrastructure money and just general infrastructure packages, do you tend to take a more step-by-step approach, or would you fall under the lines of like a Green New Deal framework where you envision a very bold network and go for it all?
I support the vision of the Green New Deal. We got to hammer out the details, but the idea that, our infrastructure is, graded at like D's and F's and C's and C minuses. Like, we have not invested to keep up with the maintenance and the improvements that are needed, let alone the sustainable improvements to make sure our trains are electrified and that we're making sure we have more public transit. Transportation sector is, 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, not every part of the country is set up right now to have huge investments in public transportation, but certainly for our urban areas, we need to improve and grow those so that it becomes more like Europe, where you just take public transportation where you can. It'll help reduce the gridlock on the road. It will reduce the parking investments that we have to make for individual vehicles. Autonomous vehicles are coming. They're here, but they're going to become more robust. We have to sort of change the way that we think about what kinds of transportation infrastructure we need. So I do think we need bold investment. And I applaud the vision of the Green New Deal, particularly because not only is it about the infrastructure, it's about good paying jobs that help people transition into the new green economy so that people aren't left behind that maybe have worked in those other sectors.
So I want to transition a little bit towards the housing crisis in the Bay Area. Do you believe the federal government has a role in trying to alleviate the crisis? And if so, what should the federal government do?
Absolutely. And the federal government can help us so much at the local level. And again, this is another experience I bring, having worked on the front lines of this issue. Local jurisdictions like cities, right, and even the county in some cases where they have the land use authority, set the conditions for creating more housing. And that's so important. We have to embrace more housing. We have to do it in ways that make sense for our community. So I really lean into transit-oriented housing, building more density around rail stations and other major transit hubs, hugely important. And in fact, I'm so proud of Burlingame City Council united behind this over the last 7 years I've been working on the council, really embraced more housing in a community that doesn't like change. Most communities don't like change, but we really had to bring the community along to help everyone understand how important it was to lean into additional housing and also housing at different levels of affordability so that our valued service workers, our teachers, the folks working in our downtown retail shops don't have to travel hours and hours outside the Bay Area to come to their jobs so that we have more sustainable communities. And we did that. And we've got, we just had a housing report. We've got nearly 2,000 units in the pipeline. And for a small city of 30,000 people, that's extraordinary. Our general plan envisions 23% population growth. And we're well on our way because of the land use conditions. So we've also set policy levers so that when that new housing is being built, we've got meaningful affordability at all levels. So very low income, moderate income. And I think in Burlingame, we're at about 16 or 17% of those units that are entitled and in the pipeline are at different levels of affordability. I say all that to answer your question. What can the federal government do? Well, it can help us create deeper and more frequent levels of affordability. And here's why. People don't build affordable housing out of the kindness of their heart because it's expensive. Everything's expensive in the Bay Area. It has to be subsidized because the market will only naturally create market rate housing. But it requires tax credits from the federal government to actually make those investments pencil out to create affordable units. So even the greatest nonprofits like Mid-Penn Housing, Mercy Housing, they're building affordable housing, but they need these tax credits too to make their projects pencil out so they don't go bankrupt. So the federal government can do more in terms of tax credits. It can do more in terms of making sure the Bay Area gets our fair share, and we've got different kinds of escalators for the high cost of living here. We certainly also need more Section 8 housing credits so that folks at the lowest end of the income spectrum can get what they need. But we also need to make sure we're distributing them so people are using all the credits that are available and we're really getting them out there in the economy. I am talking about housing and homelessness as two big priorities in my campaign. I'm also a firm believer that the homelessness crisis too is not only linked to housing and affordability, which it is in many ways, but it's also linked to mental health and addiction. And so we also need to have the federal government really investing in those services so that the county governments and the cities have the resources they need to address those these problems and house people in a dignified way. So we get people off our streets and get them the wraparound services they need to become productive members of society again.
So do you believe that the federal government should try to give money and let the localities decide how to use that? Or should the federal and state have more decision in how that's used? Where's your stance on that?
I think there should be guidelines, but I'm a firm believer that the locals, the counties and the cities know how to best deploy those funds. There should be accountability, but it shouldn't be so encumbering and burdensome that it defeats the purpose. I think really, quite frankly, as I've learned and talked to educators, even when it comes to federal resources, which are so critically needed in education and are really valued, sometimes well-meaning federal government resources require so much oversight and paperwork that small school districts have to even hire additional staff just to manage the oversight and the accountability factor. And sometimes it's not even worth it, which is tragic because we want to put resources, particularly the federal government plays a role in making sure in equity and civil rights. So it's really looking out for the most vulnerable kids in our education system. So Title I students that are, foster youth and really socioeconomically disadvantaged, and community schools, wraparound services. We need to make sure those resources, whether they're for housing, homelessness, mental health, education, that they're getting to the people who need them without so much burden and bureaucracy.
Well, speaking of federal money in education, I wanted to know your stance on the, I guess, affordability crisis with upper education in our country. How would you try to tackle that?
Yeah, it is. We have astounding amounts of student debt that folks are incurring, and it shouldn't be that way, right? Education is such an investment in our future. Here's how I think about it, and I kind of like on different tiers and priorities. I think we've got to make particularly community college accessible to everyone who wants to get that education because they're such magnificent resources. They're local. They're phenomenal opportunities, and they should be as accessible and as inexpensive as possible. I think I do think when people pay a nominal amount, a couple $100 towards their education, you got a little skin in the game, and you're getting incredible value that doesn't even begin to offset, the cost of actually delivering that education. So as long as it's super affordable, I'm okay with that. I do think that our public universities must be more affordable than they are right now. Back in, let's say 25 years ago, 22 years ago, when my husband was going through even some grad school through the UC system. It was affordable. We're just now paying off those loans. So it took time, but it was affordable and manageable as you move on. It is not that way anymore. The tuition went up. I think it may have even tripled since then, or even more. It's astounding. So I think we need to make sure that our public universities, the state of California used to have not only premier public universities, but affordable and accessible, and that's really important. What I think also is really important is that we create pipelines for workforce shortages for the kinds of fields we need to invest in. Let's create incentives for people to go into the teaching profession, to go into the mental health care profession or the healthcare profession, where there's lots of need. And there's probably a whole bunch of others like targeted that we are absolutely having severe workforce shortage. Let's make sure that those professions are getting benefits. If you go into them and you work for a certain number of years, you get your student loan significantly reduced or even eliminated. I think that would be a phenomenal program. Or if you go into the nonprofit sector, or if you are a student that is socioeconomically disadvantaged, why should we saddle you with additional debt? You should get preferences for getting your student loan reduced or eliminated. Where I think I draw the line, and might be different than other candidates, I don't necessarily think all private colleges should be free for everybody. I believe that if one chooses a private university and decides to go into a very lucrative profession, that the federal government doesn't have a responsibility to fund that type of education, because I would rather see us use those resources to fund universal health care or invest in more education in the public sector, right? You have to pick and choose. It's something we've learned at the local government. You have to prioritize. So I think those are the different tiers, and that's how I would approach really making meaningful reduction on student loan without necessarily, I think I wouldn't necessarily say, look, everybody's college education should be entirely free. I think I would prioritize based on those values. And I do think we need to also have huge investment in retraining our workforce into the green economy, because there's going to be a lot of folks whose jobs they're going to be left behind. And so I'd love to leverage particularly the community college system and the union workforce and make sure that we're providing the right training, the right technical training, the certification training that may not need a 4-year degree, but there's a lot of skills in the new green economy that people need a certification to use a certain kind of software and get a great paying job. Let's sort of innovate in education, and let's make things accessible for great opportunities into the future.
Would you support investment and subsidies into trade schools?
I would definitely explore that, and I have to learn more about how they're considered private versus public. But particularly, I think partnerships, I think union trade schools are incredible, because union jobs not only pay well, but they provide a livable, sustainable wage. They provide health benefits and something to retire on. And that's exactly where we need to go in this country. It's unsustainable for a healthy economy to not have workforce that has all those benefits.
Speaking of unionization, right now our country is kind of going through a pretty big union wave. You can look at the Amazon warehouse that got unionized, or the many Starbucks locations that are getting unionized. Would you support the PRO Act, which is a piece of legislation that is supposed to protect and help unions form in this country?
Absolutely. I think that union power has really been kind of dismantled over the last 40 or 50 years. And I think that's part of the reason that we have such astounding wealth and income inequality in this country. And when labor can come together and advocate for themselves in a reasonable way, willing to come to the table and negotiate, that's better for everybody, because then you're actually spreading that wealth around the folks that are the workforce. And, rather than what's happening right now is the folks at the very highest top of the income bracket, or the capital holders, are they've got everything, and the economy isn't working for most middle class Americans. And I think part of the solution to that. There's like a multi-pronged solution. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but there's certainly fairness that has to be updated in our tax code. But we certainly need a higher national minimum wage. But we also need a strong labor movement that's going to advocate for themselves. And that's how we're going to battle back some of these great inequities that we see so starkly, particularly in the 15th congressional district, where we've got, millionaires, billionaires, and we've got some of the poorest folks living in their automobiles, basically, trying to make ends meet.
Speaking of systems that aren't necessarily working for average middle-class Americans, can you talk on your views on healthcare and how you would like to fix that system?
Sure. I think we need to move towards universal healthcare. We've got to get there. We are one of the only, if not the only, major industrialized country in the world that hasn't solved that problem yet. The Affordable Care Act, President Obama's Obamacare, was an absolutely imperative, critical first step. And so we need to build on that. We need to leverage its successes and lessons learned and what we can do better and improve it. And I think that's our best path forward. That's the most practical path forward with the current existing system that we have. So how can we make Affordable Care Act 2.0 or 3.0 even better? Leverage the talent of the private sector, partner with them, and provide more benefits, maybe reduce the age requirements to get into Medicare, leverage the power of the federal government to lower their buying power, to lower the cost of critical prescription drug prices for basic prescriptions like insulin, right? That people should be able to get. This is not any kind of brand new, innovative, crazy treatment. This is just something that people should be able to access at a reasonable cost. Making sure that we're expanding our coverage and making sure everybody is covered. That's got to be a pathway forward. I think it would be great also to have a public option available if people want to opt in to a Medicare type option. I think that would be fantastic. And if it is competitive and better than what the private sector can offer through Affordable Care Act coverage, then it will prevail as the best option, and then we can move forward. But I think that's how I would approach universal health care for all. And I really think Speaker Pelosi has really led the way on trying to get that done, and we need to just chip away at it.
What would you say to the more liberal voters in the district who'd like to jump straight to a Medicare for all system?
Yes, I understand their perspective that they want a government solution immediately. I think I would say two things. That came up for a vote in the House of Representatives this past summer. And we have a majority of Democrats in the House, and it only got about 150 votes. So it died on the floor in the House of Representatives where there's a majority of Democrats. So I don't pretend to understand all the details yet. I will, but there's a reason that it was deemed not a practical way to move forward for a whole bunch of reasons. So if we can't even get a majority of Democrats to vote for it in the House, it certainly isn't going to pass the Senate. I'm less concerned about slogans and about saying, let's have Medicare for all. I want to get to solutions. I want to be practical and get people the health care they need. So I think the way to do that and the way to leverage the private sector based on where we are in America today, the most practical way to get to the outcome we want is by improving and expanding the Affordable Care Act. And that is what the speaker has set out as the way we've got to move forward. And I think that makes a whole heck of a lot of good sense.
On the completely reverse side of that, what would you say to some of the more moderate or even conservative members of the district who want less government involvement in our healthcare system and want more private influence?
I believe healthcare is a human right. There should not be any human being, regardless of their immigration status, regardless of who they are, where they came from, or how much money they have, that shouldn't be able to get an antibiotic or a treatment that they need to survive and to treat, to keep their kids healthy. That is unconscionable. So we need to do a better job. We are the only industrialized country in the world that hasn't figured it out yet. in a real, I mean, we're on our way, but that we have to lead on this because it's an investment in our future of our country. And it's just like investing in pre-K is an investment in the outcomes, the long-term outcomes. We will ultimately save money if we're just like, that's how I would probably approach it with the more conservative folks. Look, if you invest in people's preventative health care now to make sure they get the preventative health care, that they're getting their regular checkups and their their the women's preventative health services, men's preventative health services, you're going to save on the back end the cost of so much, not only pain and suffering, but literally economics down the line too. So ultimately, it's a good, smart, prudent investment for the country.
So very early on in the podcast, you mentioned how there needs to be a rebuilding of trust in this country between our constituents and our elected officials. Can you, if you were elected to Congress, can you talk to how you would try to keep that connection and try to rebuild that trust?
Sure. Well, I think one of the most important things that representatives can do when we go to Congress is to stay in close contact with the people they're representing and really understand the needs of the people. And so, when I was first elected to city council back in 2015, 1 month after I was elected, I started holding coffee and conversation events in local coffee shops in Burlingame, one on Broadway, and then another one on Burlingame Avenue, about every 6 weeks, every other month. When I was mayor and COVID hit, I transitioned those to virtual events every week during shelter in place because people needed to stay close to their mayor. They wanted, there were so many confusing health orders. They needed trusted information. But it was not only sharing information, it was listening and understanding what the community needed. And a lot of that information informed why I founded and convened a group called the Burlingame Collaborative in Burlingame, brought together in the height of COVID. I think May I started bringing it together, and then our first meeting was in June. 60 different community leaders from, the business sector, the nonprofit sector, the hospital, education, educators, community activists, Rotarians, faith leaders, because we have a lot of different faith communities, to come together and meet on Zoom and figure out where are the gaps in our COVID response? What's not working? What are people either not getting the right information? We learned that people were scared to go to the food pantry. Some folks that were undocumented because they felt like it was scary to register and they might not feel comfortable. We figured out a back end to resolve that problem through the collaborative. People were feeling isolated. We came up with some volunteer programs that really bridged the gap between seniors and teenagers. Businesses were struggling. We came up with this magnificent group of volunteers just figured out a way to promote and sell in an online platform local gift cards so that folks who wanted to support local businesses could just kind of invest and pay it forward and buy some local gift cards. These are just some little examples, but it's that kind of grassroots, knowing how to bring people together, listening to people to get the right advisors who are on the ground and then solve problems. I think that's something that I've practiced for 7 years at the local level. And it's the kind of leadership that trained in the Army, you have to lead from the front. You have to be on the ground. You never ask any soldier to do anything you wouldn't be willing to do yourself. That's the kind of stuff that builds trust in communities. And I would continue to stay really close to the people I represent and listen as much as I share information too. Regular newsletters so they know what's going on in Congress, what issues are we talking about, seeking their input. And then just being the kind of person that is trustworthy is very important, that they've known, maybe has kind of come up through the community, and that you're known and trusted. And then in Congress, building, as I said before, those long-term relationship-centered change, building relationships with people that you may not agree with on every hot button issue, but finding some where you can find common ground, and getting to the point where we're being civil again. We're not just screaming at one another, and we're not demonizing one another for our differences, but we are having a legitimate civic discourse. That's what we need to role model in Congress. And I think I've proven, even under pressure, to always be civil and respectful. And that's the kind of leadership I think we need to bring to Congress to restore, I think, trust again.
So in terms of speaking about rebuilding trust and something that does seem to have bipartisan support, what is your stance on the trading restriction bans that is going through the House and through the Senate?
Yeah, to prevent elected officials from manipulating the system. I think they probably make a lot of sense. Um, it's just there's so much when people have economic benefit from special information. I mean, it's like insider trading, right? In the stock market, people get thrown in jail for that kind of stuff. Look what happened to Martha Stewart. She was the poster child for that, and who knows, probably a lot of other people do it worse. But we can't have our elected officials profiteering off of information. So, and I think just like we have to have more transparency into who is donating to people's campaigns, the dark money that certainly, there's a lot of rules around campaign funds, individuals, everything's publicly disclosed, but there's a lot of political action committees that you don't know who's funding them, and that can kind of come in as independent expenditures and invest huge amounts of dollars in candidates that nobody ever knows who's behind them.
I am so thankful that you took the time to be here today to come onto the Skyline View podcast. Is there anything that you would like to say in closing?
This has just been such a thoughtful conversation, Zachary. Great questions. I'm always so impressed with young people and young academics that are thinking about all these important issues. I guess I'd like to just reiterate my top priorities in this race that I am putting at the forefront that I think would really resonate with a lot of your listeners. We have to heal our planet. Like, climate action has to be number one. All this other stuff is moot if we don't have a planet to live on. And I think young people in particular care a lot about that. I am talking about housing and homelessness as top priorities. I'm talking about education and mental health. And these are things, as a parent of teenagers that's not only navigated the pandemic and as a former foster parent too, I understand how important all these issues are to young people. And that's one of the reasons I wanna fight for improvements in all these areas when I get to Congress. Have a lot of respect for all the different candidates in this race. We all bring different kinds of experience to the mix. I hope I've at least built a case today why I think sort of my yes, local government experience, but really broad life experience brings something different to the mix. And there's been a lot of my heroes who have been super successful in Congress, who were never even elected officials before they went there. Speaker Pelosi had never been an elected official. Ro Khanna down the road, never been an elected official. They've been highly effective. And many of my other heroes came from city or county government. Dianne Feinstein, Barbara Boxer, Anna Eshtu, Zoe Lofgren. Eric Swalwell was 2 years on city council before he was elected to Congress, and he ousted a Democratic incumbent, which was pretty extraordinary. I hope when people are evaluating the candidates in our experience, that they really look at the potential to send somebody to this seat who will probably, given the demographics of this district, will probably stay in this seat for the better part of 10, maybe even 15, 20 years it could be. All of us are in, I don't think I'm the youngest, but I'm 47. This seat is going to probably stick with whoever wins this for a while. So we need to really evaluate who of the candidates has the greatest potential to be a really impactful member of Congress in the long run. And I hope that I've at least built a case during this campaign as we're getting the word out to why I think I'm the right woman for the job. So I hope anybody who's listening and wants to get engaged will reach out to the campaign. It's emilybeachforcongress.com. Follow us on social media. We could use all the help amplifying the message and the digital ads that are coming out, and really look forward to meeting many of you in person.
If you enjoyed this conversation with Councilmember Emily Beach and you want to hear more, we'll have the other discussions linked below. We will also link our social medias and our website at theskylineview.com. Go there if you want to see more great content from the Skyline View. Thanks again. Goodbye.